Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out today. I'm Jim Robbins. I'm Dean of Academics at the Institute of World Politics. IWP is the private, independent, fully accredited graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs located right here in Washington, D.C. We offer master's degrees, graduate certificates, and doctoral degrees. For more information on our great school, check out our website at iwp.edu. I would also like to thank Frank Filicomo and the National Review Institute for co-sponsoring this event. The National Review Institute is a nonprofit 501c3 journalistic think tank that preserves and promotes the legacy of the great William F. Buckley Jr., supports the National Review mission, and advances the principles of a free society through educational and outreach programs. Also, a huge thank you to Aaron Fox Schiff for use of their wonderful facility. So thanks for that. And the Lafayette Company for bringing us all together. The topic of our debate is a world in crisis, national security priorities for the next administration. When we started planning this event last July, it was fairly clear who the next president would be. Not at all clear who the current president was. Now, only 2 months later, we have no idea who the next president will be, and the sitting president is sitting at the beach. Yet, national security challenges do not simply vanish when America tunes out. If anything, they accelerate. The war against Russia and Ukraine drags on. Israel continues its counterterrorist and hostage rescue mission in Gaza, as other Iranian terror proxies destabilize the region. Yesterday, on September 11th, we were reminded of the threat of globally networked terrorism, with the Taliban back in power in Afghanistan, and new al-Qaeda leader Saif al-Adil threatening another 9/11. Communist China is on the offensive, challenging United States global leadership. Rogue states, unchecked international migration, rampant debt, inflation, and declining U.S. power and influence all contribute to this climate of crisis. These are challenges that will face whoever takes the oath of office this coming January. The question for our panel is how to address these challenges. We have selected a group of experts who approach the question of America's role in the world from slightly different directions. First, we have Team Energetic Foreign Policy. Noah Rothman is a senior writer at National Review. He earned 2 degrees with a focus on security policy in the post-Soviet space, and he's the author of 2 books, his latest being The Rise of the New Puritans Fighting Back Against the Progressives' War on Fun. Dr. John Callahan is a professor of strategy at IWP. In addition to his academic experience, John was a public affairs officer at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and has also served as a PAO at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and for the Department of Defense. Next, we have Team Restrained Foreign Policy. Michael Brendan Doherty is a senior writer at National Review and the William F. Buckley Senior Scholar for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, with a special focus on the American right and foreign policy. Dan Caldwell is a public policy advisor at Defense Priorities and is also a former congressional staffer and a Marine Corps veteran of the Iraq War. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you.
We will ask a series of questions over the next 90 minutes. Each team will have a total of 10 minutes to make their case, with some allowances for polite back and forth because we don't turn our mics off. Also for the audience, we hope to have some time for Q&A at the end, and there are cards provided for you to write down your questions that staff will collect, so please pass them to them and hopefully we'll get to those. And also, hopefully by the end of this debate, we will have the whole world sorted out. We will open with 3-minute statements from both members of each team, starting with Noah.
First of all, thank you very much to the Institute of World Politics for hosting this. Thank you, Ellen Carmichael, for putting this together. It is an absolute treat and a pleasure. When we talk about geopolitics, particularly about threats from state and non-state actors in the general discourse, we emphasize often the distinctions between our adversaries: Sunni and Shiite, Marxist and theocrat, irredentists, and their old enemies. They don't observe the distinctions that we so often do. Moscow, prior to the October 7th massacre, hosted Hamas representatives on 2 separate occasions. It provides diplomatic cover to Iran and multinational institutions, and Iran in turn provides it with weapons to prosecute its war of conquest in Ukraine, drones, and now ballistic missiles. Iran in turn is given its own cover by Moscow, and it is supported in its adventurism and support for proxy terrorist operations in the Middle East. China supports all of them, gives material support to Moscow and Iran, both weapons and dual-use materials. It trains with all their militaries. And of course, they act together in concert in multilateral institutions. We observe these distinctions as a form of a rhetorical trick that we play on ourselves. It allows us to avoid a rather unambiguous conclusion. The theaters may vary, but it is all one war. U.S. policy should be to prevent the restoration of the inviolable spheres of influence that typified the geopolitical environment prior to the Second World War and certainly prior to the end of the Cold War. The global marketplace is not a especially old invention. We've had it roughly since 1990, 1991, after a very long interim following the outbreak of World War I in 1914. If it is not preserved, it can collapse. We are seeing something akin to that in the Red Sea. The Biden administration was very reluctant to engage in the Houthi rebels and their attacks on merchant marine vessels. As a result, the shipping magnates who operate those vessels are rerouting around Africa, increasing the cost of global goods, and compelling shipping enterprises to align themselves in convoy with the real power in the region: Chinese vessels, Russian vessels, which are occasionally fired on by the Houthis, but generally not, because they are an Iranian proxy force. We can see that in other regions. We can see our frontline partners in the NATO states, and we can see our frontline partners in the Pacific, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, align with the bullies in their region rather than balance against them, because we are a far distant power in retreat. And if our power is not manifest, it makes much more sense to take care of yourself by cozying up to the revisionist power in your neighborhood. Therefore, just to sum up, the tested way to preserve our influence in the world and the peace and the prosperity that has accompanied it is through deterrence. Robust military, the development thereof, and the forward deployment of it, backed by the credible threat of its use. We have not improved on those terms, and it is the best way to preserve peace, which is all our goals.
Thank you, Noah. John?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And it's a real privilege and honor to be a part of the group here. I would follow up largely in agreement. It's been said that the business of the United States is business, and it remains true. It's our fundamental purpose in the world, and it's global. The U.S. has business everywhere, and as long as we do, and we're talking at least a quarter of our GDP tied directly to international business of one way or another, we also have interest everywhere, and we therefore have to be everywhere in some shape or form. Now, for the past 10, 15 years, we've had sequestration. We've had looks at diminishing and reducing the DoD budget and looking at how to operate a constrained financial environment. Well, and undoubtedly the constraint is there, but the demand signals have not changed. And you go to the combatant commands and nothing is diminished. They have even more operations now than they did 15 years ago, especially EUCOM, and it's obvious why. There's a command that 15 years ago was focused on alliance building and security, and now they have to act like a warfighting command again. And you see that sort of everywhere. And that's not to say that U.S. influence and investment can just be unrestrained. It obviously can't. My position is that the U.S. needs to be everywhere all the time with credible force. but that the way that obviously has to be thoughtful, it has to be restrained, it has to be cost efficient. I would look for savings in DoD elsewhere than the actual commitments. I'd find it in different places. But another point that I'd like to follow up on, there's a saying that the enemy gets a vote, and we're in a world of enemies. We always were, although there were times when it didn't feel that way. But we also have to consider what the enemy's perception of war is. Just as you mentioned, we're at war with many of our enemies. If you look at Sun Tzu's approach to war, we are definitely in it. Hybrid war, that's war, and it's being perpetuated against us by enemies. And I think that the U.S. should sort of move toward abandoning some of the restraints and shackles that we've felt since the Cold War based on old assumptions of the Cold War, and actually act more like we're in that war. Because it needs to be won. It doesn't need to just end. It needs to, the good guys actually need to win for the world to go forward in a way that is good for our business, our economy, and our way of life. So that's my position. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Michael.
One word that the other side of this debate has already taken that I'd like to take up is credibility. The U.S. can make promises we can keep, or the U.S. can continue to make promises we cannot possibly hope to keep. And I heard a lot of rhetoric on the other side here. It sounded pretty limitless. It's all one war, no spheres of influence, everywhere all the time. The demand side keeps expanding. It's true, we make promises we cannot possibly keep. It's actually been the biggest problem for American foreign policy for decades now. We promised we could transform the Middle East, democratic revolutions. We promised we could somehow uproot the Taliban, but not ever confront its sponsors in Pakistan. But somehow we're going to do this. We're going to have a culture then in the Pentagon and in the field of lying about it for 20 years, color-coded charts symbolizing nothing. This lack of credibility extends throughout the Department of Defense at this point, to the point where it's alienating military families and destroying recruitment. In just 2 years, our Army, for not hitting its recruiting goals, has lost 2 divisions. This is like the worst day of war in history for the United States, and we've inflicted it on ourselves. The Navy, just 2 weeks ago, said it was thinking of scuttling 17 ship projects because it cannot man them. The overwhelming source of our strength, our military strength, is our military families and manpower, a tradition that goes to a very certain class of people in the United States, overwhelmingly served. Recruitment's basically from 80% from military families, historic. We've broken their trust. The fathers who served 20 years ago are telling their sons not to sign up. We have lost credibility there. Our Navy promises to build ships in a certain time span before the plans are even finished. That's why we're 3 years behind on the missile frigate constellation. We have radically expanded America's commitments across the last several decades. We have not expanded our share of GDP dedicated to defense. We've limited it. As we said with sequester, we are facing declining recruitment. We don't really face a choice between expanding our commitments. We only face the choice of expanding our bluff. Military spending and military investment is like playing poker with your cards facing out. The other players see how many troops you have, how many ships you're building, what your resources really are. And yet we keep throwing more and more into the pot of poker. We throw Ukraine's borders, North Macedonia, Sweden, 900 miles more Finland's borders perhaps. For what? And what are we doing to back that up? A 2-year spending commitment from Sweden. In the face of watching Germany in the very same year renege on all of its extraordinary promises of spending in Ukraine. It's reduced them 4 times its promises 4 times in the last 2 years. This is not sustainable. A foreign policy of making promises you cannot keep actually constrains you from making more credible promises that are more in line with your resources and fundamentally the will of the American people to back them up with their blood and their treasure.
Thank you, Michael. Dan.
Well, thank you, Dr. Robbins, for the introduction. I just quibble with one thing. I don't consider myself an expert. I just have the honor to work around some really smart people and be able to sponge up little nuggets of wisdom they have and then spit them back out. And I sound a lot smarter than I really am. But again, thank you for IWP for hosting this and NRI. I'm glad I'm following Michael because I think my remarks will complement his well. So I fundamentally think the debate around foreign policy is a matter of can versus should, meaning what can the United States do versus should. And that is because for really the first time in my lifetime, the United States faces significant constraints on its industrial, military, and financial power. These constraints effectively end the era of unchecked U.S. global dominance, and they require a foreign policy rooted in the reality of today as opposed to an idealized version of the past. While the United States truly, even at the end of the Cold War, has never existed in a space where it has an unconstrained power position, the reality is that, as I said, we have significant limits on our power. On the financial front, our debt is now $35 trillion. Our annual deficit may exceed the entire GDP of Russia, and we have record inflation that we haven't seen in nearly 40 years. Michael walked through some of the challenges with our military. It's been depleted by 20 years of misadventures in the Middle East and an emptying of arsenals to support the war in Ukraine. And again, Michael did a really good job laying out some of the recruiting challenges as well. On the industrial front, our military-industrial complex and our defense industrial base have had one failed acquisition project after another, and the ones that do make it through, they're often over budget and behind schedule, in large part because we have a shortage of skilled workers in the United States. In addition, unlike at the end of the Cold War, we actually have a true competitor now in China. At the turn of the century, China's share of the global GDP was about 5%. Today, it's about 20% compared to the United States is 25%. This has enabled them to grow their military power, and while they don't have the ability to project significant amounts of military power on a global scale, they can challenge us effectively in the key theater, which is the Pacific and probably the most vital region in the world. There are things we can do to overcome some of these constraints in the short term. We could reform entitlements, which I actually support. We could increase taxes, which I don't. But if we're being honest, those are likely politically untenable. We could reinstitute a draft to make up for recruiting shortfalls, but that would likely lower the quality of military personnel and could lead to social unrest like we had the last time that we had a draft. The government could use things like the Defense Production Act to force civilian manufacturers to increase production of weapon systems, but that could lead to price increases and shortage within the civilian markets. But in the long run, none of these efforts will overcome the long-term constraints that we face, and they do not change the need that we need a foreign policy that is much more restrained instead of pursuing global primacy, lest we face a national security disaster. I think we're going to get into what that will look like in a discussion, but I actually think one of my co-panelists, Noah, had a really good description of what it could look like. And I don't often agree with what Noah writes about foreign policy, but he wrote a pretty righteous column, in my view, condemning people that use the term walk and chew bubblegum to describe American foreign policy. I think we'd all agree it's pretty lazy. But I think Noah actually closed his column very well and kind of sums up how I approach foreign policy is life is full of trade-offs. Sometimes you need to walk or chew gum.
Thank you. All right, now we'll get to the questions, and we'll do it again. We'll go by teams, so we'll kind of keep it loose. First question on the war in Ukraine. It's been going on for 2.5 years. Hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides and billions of dollars spent by the world. The war is nowhere near its conclusion, if we even know what that conclusion would look like. The United States and many Western allies have been durable supporters of Ukraine, But as time has passed, questions have arisen over both the size of the commitment and whether the U.S. has any real interest in this conflict. So what should the next president do about Ukraine and more broadly about Russia? And we'll start with Team A.
Well, I think that the next administration should make a commitment to allow the Ukrainians to use the weapons they've been given and the additional weapons that should flow to actually prosecute to a victory and create enough pain that the Russians stop and go home. That's the quick summary.
Certainly the next administration shouldn't behave as this administration has done. I had the misfortune of having to sit through Kamala Harris pretending as though her administration had been the hawk's hawk on this war. What have they done? They had been paralyzed by the fear of Russian nuclear saber rattling to the point that they talked themselves out of the distribution of the weapons platforms that Kyiv asks for, only to finally give in after the time at which it would have been maximally valuable to provide those weapons platforms. Say nothing of long-range missiles, multiple launch rocket systems, tanks, fixed-wing aircraft, cluster munitions, you name it. The administration has been very reluctant to antagonize Moscow. They invent red lines in their head, only to find those red lines are crossed, and they don't actually mean as much to Vladimir Putin as they insist they did. And then they backtrack after so much time has been lost. The stakes are incredibly high in Ukraine, to a degree that I don't think a lot of people who are critics of that enterprise believe. Not because we have a lot of material investments in Ukraine. We do not. Europe does. Europe's our primary trading partner. And a lot of European states are on the border of Ukraine, and those states have living memory of Russian occupation. We go our own way, and they go theirs too. They have politics in Poland and Romania and Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. They have their own enterprises to protect, and they have their own means to do so. In a situation in which the United States is no longer prima inter pares, no longer calling the shots and managing our allies, they go their own way. And that introduces infinitely more variables and infinitely more possibilities for a conflagration based on a miscalculation or a mistake. The United States cannot disengage from these regions just because it feels good to do so. The obligations are there for a reason, and our forward positioning, our forward posture, and our proactivity ensures that we are not drawn into conflicts that spiral out of control accidentally or without our input. A world in which the United States is in retrenchment is a less stable world, and one in which the United States could paradoxically be more engaged in conflict, not less.
Okay, the rebuttal.
I want to start off by throwing out three numbers, or three sets of numbers: 43, 1.2 million, and 2 years. 43 is the average age of a Ukrainian conscript. What does that mean? It means that a significant number of the men and women currently serving in the Ukrainian armed forces are in their 40s and 50s. Ukraine is simply running out of fighting age men and women. They're running out of people. To put that in perspective, the average age of a U.S. military service member right now is 28 years. I recently had the opportunity to go to Ukraine. I spent about 4 or 5 days in Odessa. I met several groups of Ukrainian soldiers. I met one group of officer candidates, all of whom were veterans of the Donbass War, the war from 2014 to 2022. And none of them thought that they would get pulled back into the service. They were all in their late 30s or early 40s, and some of them were very grievously wounded. And bottom line is Ukraine is scraping the bottom of the manpower barrel. They're actually doing what the Russians did, and what a lot of people are making fun of them now is basically pulling men out of their prisons and recreating Soviet-style penal battalions. The second number is 1.2 million, as in Russia. Even if the United States and the EU meet their artillery production numbers by the end of the year, they will produce 1.2 million more artillery shells than the EU and the United States will. And that is with a tremendous effort to try and overcome that gap. And then 2 years. 2 years is the number of years it Raytheon currently projects it's going to take to build an entire Patriot battery. They're building multiple ones at a time, but Ukraine currently has 4. They want 25. The United States has as an operation about 50 total. I may be a little off there. And then our partners have several dozen more units. The reality is that the war in Ukraine is a math problem, and the math and the numbers, I'm really bad at math. I was a Marine grunt. Basic arithmetic shows that simply the current strategy of wishing them towards total victory, whether we mean it or not, is just not sustainable. So ultimately, we need to pivot to a more realistic strategy that recognizes Ukraine is not going to get all its territory back, that Europe needs to stand up and do more, and they can take the lead in resourcing a defensive strategy that preserves something of a Ukrainian nation going forward. And I think most importantly for the United States is we do need to recognize that we have limited interests at stake, and we should not do something like have a permanent defense commitment to Ukraine, because one, it's really not in our interest to require us to devote more resources to Europe, where we should be devoting elsewhere. And also, two, I'm not somebody who buys the argument that the war was solely because of NATO expansion, but it does provide an incentive for the Russians to keep fighting. So I think we should take that off the table. Michael, I don't know if you had anything you want to add to that.
I just want to add that there's a tension between in the vision, Noah, you articulated, where Europe has the most at stake in the Ukraine conflict, more than we do. The United States doesn't do significant trade with Ukraine. We can't be invaded by passing through its territory, et cetera. And yet you want the United States to remain the preeminent military power in Europe, when what Ukraine could use is like tanks from Germany that actually work, instead of ones that don't work but get promised to them and then delivered 2 years late, and then get blown by a drone made by Iran for like 1/10 the cost. Europe needs to contribute to its own defense. Angela Merkel turned Germany away from its defense industry, away from geopolitics into geoengineering. I wonder how they like the weather now. I hope it's worth it. But this is not a sustainable path for us. Europe needs to find a collective security will for its own survival, because the American people are not going to continue to put up with this, especially if we are told over and over again that Europe has more at stake than we do, and yet we're spending and effectively committing twice as much, along with the credibility of our world-led order. That is not sustainable.
I was invoked. Do I get a chance to respond?
Sure.
So, both of you have mentioned manpower shortages, both our own and Ukraine's. And as a digression, I'm actually surprised, especially from you, Michael, that you didn't bring up what I hear mostly from military families as the inducement against sending your children into the services, which is the social engineering in which it's engaged in, the attacks on military culture within the military framework, which is the primary reason I hear people saying the pipeline is stopping with us, not because they don't want to fight for this country. And to speak to that, Dan, when you were there, and I've been to Ukraine as well, but not in a long time, when you spoke with the service personnel who are fighting, did you hear one of them say they'd prefer to surrender?
What they did say is that ultimately the people in the Donbass and Crimea don't want to be with us. They want to protect their homes. Most of the people I met with were more in the western part of the country. And they were a lot of them, the biggest thing I saw in people's faces was exhaustion. And when you weren't near somebody like from the conference we were a part of, a lot of people were at the point like, look, the Russians have done awful things to our country. We want them out. But they don't believe, a lot of them don't believe anymore that the people in the Donbass or Crimea really want to be part of a Ukrainian nation. And again, they weren't saying they wanted to surrender. They weren't saying they wanted to stop fighting, but they were starting, in my mind, to admit that a total victory wasn't possible. And again, I
mean, you're describing the conditions that prevailed prior to February 2022. We're not fighting in Donbass necessarily just anymore. We're fighting in Zaporizhzhia, fighting in Kharkiv. That's where the fight is. So they say that we're willing to surrender to the atrocities that we've all witnessed.
I don't think they're thinking at the level of what would an ultimate peace deal look like.
The point
I think that they just are realizing is like there's a difference between a total victory and what ultimately how the war might end.
The point I'm getting at broadly is that, and I'm often accused of American chauvinism, guilty, but at no point do I assume that I have the power to dictate those terms to Ukraine, that I have the power to dictate what land it surrenders to Russian occupiers. I certainly don't. So something that actually a lot of those who are keen to lend undue credence to Russian narratives will say, well, the United States absorbed all these powers into NATO, as though we dictated those terms. We did not. These were legislative desires on the part of these countries They were legislatively approved. They were approved by our legislature and subsequently by all 33 NATO members. These are democratic initiatives that bubble up from the ground up. We don't have any control over them, and we don't dictate those terms. They are the expression of the popular will, which is a distinction dramatically from our adversaries in places like Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia, where no such democratic mechanisms exist.
Wait, John, you've been to Ukraine recently. What's your perspective?
Well, I think that the Ukrainians that I'm involved with is a mix of folks in the diaspora who are here, and the diaspora, of course, are gung-ho because they're here, and a mix of folks in Kiev at the ministries and working the front line, and the feeling I get from those folks is we're in a long slog. They would like it to end, but that it can't end like this. It can't end with key areas taken, with population, with hundreds of thousands of children gone, all those things that have happened. It can't stop like this, and that's how I perceive things there on the ground. And as far as our interest in Europe, I mean, this is a Germany problem in a lot of ways, the security situation in Europe. And when President Trump talked about the 2% so stridently in Europe, that's who he was talking to. Other countries weren't meeting the goal either. But when you're the fourth or fifth economy in the world and you contribute about this much to global security, that is a big problem. And you see that now. Germany is the motivator of Europe. Sure, yeah, Brussels, but it's Berlin, and the Germans aren't willing to do it. They're not willing to compromise on how they perceive their post Cold War role, the relative wealth that they got by creating the euro and all that. And so I think one of the challenges in getting some efficiency and benefit from U.S. defense and foreign policy is getting more activists with the countries like that, working with them, and they, yes, you do have to step up, you really do, because wait till we leave and see what that world looks like. And the free rider thing is really nice when you're the free rider, but I know Asia is a later topic, but you take it to Asia, and the Japanese have largely stepped up in a way that the Germans have completely, utterly not, especially in recent months where they've scaled back the promises of support. Yeah.
Dr. Robbins, if you don't mind, I actually think there may be an area of agreement here, although a level down or two we may disagree, but I actually have to say, I think, Noah, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're getting at this, but I would just say is like how we have treated the Ukrainians and these promises we have made. I think, we should have made the promises. No, you maybe think we should have made the promises and kept them. But regardless is that we have let that country down by, just how we've acted and what we've encouraged them to do. And by not following through on promises, again, I think the difference is maybe we think we should have followed through or never made them, but it is how the United States has handled Ukraine, I think, in the post-Cold War era has been atrocious.
Well, can I go back? This is actually in the agreement category, but I think one of the fundamental problems with U.S. foreign policy post-Cold War is the lack of consistency from administration to administration. And you go back and read Kissinger's Diplomacy, which, whatever you think about Kissinger, it's a great book, and he opens with the whole dichotomy against utopianism and realism. And when we oscillate so radically every 4 years, sometimes every 2 years, depending on how Congress goes, there is no consistency. And what would help is consistency of U.S. foreign policy goals writ large, enforced at a macro level. And then, as you said, and I think we all agree, yeah, let's think really hard about the promises we make and make the ones we can keep, but then stick with them. And that makes it makes the U.S. a difficult partner to have these days. And yeah, okay. I think we agree, but there you go.
Michael, do you have any last comment before we leave this topic?
No, I'll say this to agree again, but agree with Noah. No, we don't. I don't believe in compelling Ukraine to surrender, because I believe that one's nationalism is one's own business. But that's also why we have to be careful about the over promises that the American people aren't willing to follow up on, and also again, the culture of lying. I mean, we did this thing where Congress authorizes a certain aid package to Ukraine, and then once it passes, DoD looks at it, the kind of permanent foreign policy courtier class looks at it, or surrounding the executive, and says like, oh, we could juice this up if we just write down the value of all of the weapons. And now we have $1 billion hole in the Pentagon's already sequestered budget because replacing those weapons costs more than what we estimated, because we just wrote the value down in order to give more. That culture of lying is and self-deception is what will be written in the history books if the United States suffers a big tragedy.
Thank you. Moving on to the next one. We are nearing the one-year anniversary of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel, in which they killed 1,200 people and took 251 hostages, many of whom have since died. Since then, Israel has been conducting operations to destroy Hamas and rescue the hostages. The U.S. has generally supported Israel, but with some limits. Meanwhile, Iran continues to fund terrorist proxies like Hezbollah, Iraqi militants, and the Houthis. What should U.S. policy be towards Israel and the Gaza conflict, and what should be done about Iran? How about if we start with Team B first?
If you want to start first, though.
Yeah. So, first of all, I think in regards to the conflict in Gaza, I said at the beginning of the conflict that I do think the United States should provide support for Israel, is do what it's traditionally done, which is be a provider of weapons and financial aid. In some ways, I actually made the argument that, for a variety of reasons, is that the United States actually has more of a reason to fund and support Israel than Ukraine. They are, we are a bigger trading partner. We have more cultural links. If you look at the security architecture of the Middle East, there is a key role for the United States to have Israel there. So I do believe in ultimately supporting Israel. I just have to say, in all honesty, is that it is nearly impossible today to have an in-depth conversation about our policy towards Israel and the Middle East without it devolving into just accusations back and forth of, oh, you're supporting settler colonialism, you're anti-Semitic. And it's really unfortunate because I don't think it benefits the United States and I don't think it benefits Israel. I will say is that going forward, I think the United States has some key interests in the broader Middle East related to the conflict. I think first and foremost is that it would be absolutely disastrous for the United States to get into a major regional war yet again into the Middle East. I do not think our military is ready to fight it effectively in terms of our munition supplies, our force posture. And that issue specifically is that you have thousands of U.S. troops spread across isolated outposts that can be easily targeted and overrun by Iran or Iranian proxies. We actually, in many ways, actually fund those Iranian proxies. The Iranian proxies are part of the Iraqi government, which we support. Our troops in Iraq are training the troops of the Iraqi government, and it's the most counterproductive and insane mission the military has in the world right now, because the U.S. taxpayer is funding and U.S. troops are training the people who are literally trying to kill them. And so I think that is first and foremost, is that it's not in our interest to get pulled into a major conflict with Iran. Longer term, I do think that we need to retrench from the region. I would say not completely, because we still do have, even in my more limited view of American interests, we do still have interest in that region. I think we do not want to see the rise of a regional hegemon. I think the good news is that there's forces at play, even without a big American presence, that would prevent that. And also, too, I think having another outside power come in and do that would be difficult for whether it's Russia or China. They either don't have the forces, although it would be good, and Noah referenced this earlier about how China's playing more of a role in securing the Red Sea. That's actually, in my mind, an example of buck passing. China has reaped tremendous benefits from the Middle East without having to pay a price. After the Iraq War, for example, the Chinese government, through their front companies, got a lot of the rebuilding contracts. They've been able to establish an economic foothold in the Emirates and the Saudis, and that began all the way back under the Bush administration. It wasn't something that just started happening. So I think that would be good. But beyond that issue of a regional hegemon, I would note too that was the policy under the Nixon administration during the Cold War, and we were able to do that effectively without a large military presence. The second one is we do need to maintain a capability to strike and destroy terrorists that have the intent, but also the capability who threaten the United States and core American interests. Not every Houthi or every Sunni extremist or every wannabe Revolutionary Guard who gets on Twitter and screams death to America, but people who have an actual ability and intent to harm the United States. And so I think those are the core interests. And instead of trying to attempt more failed nation building exercises or trying to maintain a large permanent presence in the region, I think we should shift to a posture that prioritizes those interests.
I just want to add in, I think, I said before that nationalism is one's own business. And in the case of Israel, there is no meaningful restraint the American public can put on the Israeli public's desire to reach a just and tolerable solution in Gaza. And they've also shown remarkably probably too much patience with American nitpicking and second guessing. Meanwhile, they have demonstrated huge leaps in competence in executing missions while limiting collateral damage in this war that have been astonishing and have silenced those in Europe who tried to get all eyes on Rafah. This is our relationship with Israel also, as I believe Dan hinted at, helps us stay out of a major regional war with Iran, both by its recent modus vivendi through the Abraham Accords with the Sunni powers to help restrain Iran, and also through its unbelievable capacity to execute low-cost, highly disruptive operations in Iran against its nuclear program. This is like a bang for the buck U.S. alliance that is really makes a strong case for itself. And it makes a strong case for itself in that we don't actually have to do that much to maintain it. And our people aren't particularly bothered by Israel's behavior. The encampments on college campuses represent the tiniest slice of American public opinion, and one that any administration could easily ignore.
So, I share Dan's objective not to be drawn into new major wars. I also agree with Dan's proposition that no major wars is limited so that we understand that it does not include global war on terrorism, grass mowing operations, targeted pinprick strikes on potential threats given actionable intelligence. We're going back to the proposition that I made earlier that we talk ourselves into distinctions that our adversaries do not observe. So the Houthi problem, well, that's distinct. We can execute targeted strikes on their operations and their, the facilities where they're launching these attacks, but we certainly can't do that for Hamas or Hezbollah. We can attack the Shiite militias that are firing on us, indeed killing American forces, 3 of whom died in January, Jarrett and Jordan. But we can't go after Hamas, even though they're murdering Americans, putting a gun to the back of an American citizen's head and pulling the trigger and facing no consequences for that. And we observe this distinction because, well, how would Iran act? And that's precisely what we should be talking ourselves about. Not Hezbollah, not the Houthis, not Hamas, not the Shiite militias or Kataib Hezbollah or whomever. It should be Iran. Iran is pulling all the strings. And while we do not want to get into a war with Iran, the way to avoid that is to create a durable, robust security architecture in the region that includes Israel and its Sunni neighbors. And how did we go about doing that? It's called the Abraham Accords. And the Abraham Accords had one genius invention, which was to put the Palestinian question to the side. The Palestinian question did not need to be resolved in order to pursue normalization. This is not an idea that sprang from Jared Kushner's forehead. It had been bubbling up from think tanks, especially on the right, for a very long time. But it was implemented very effectively by the Trump administration. And it was arrested on 10/7 because of the so-called Arab Street, which resents wholly and mightily Israeli action against Palestinians in whatever form or faction they take. Now we're talking about the two-state solution again, as though Hamas has any interest in living side by side with Israel, much less the Palestinian factions in charge of the West Bank, with whom it is eternally at war. It has no interest in that. The same could be said of the West Bank. The objective here is to end this war on Israel's terms as quickly as possible, demonstrate to the region that it is the strong horse they thought it was, that the intelligence and security architecture that they were building is worth fighting for, worth supporting, and therefore move past the Palestinian question again and then begin to create these relationships designed only to hem in Iran and create a space where we can successfully exfiltrate our forces, disengage perhaps, not diplomatically and certainly not permanently militarily, but just pull back a little bit of these commitments, because otherwise we have absolutely no choice but to be on the front lines in the absence of that architecture. And the way to get there is to let Israel win as quickly and as aggressively as it possibly can, and get this behind us. The sooner we get this behind us, the campuses die down, then the Sunni states begin to get more comfortable with the normalization process.
So my coping mechanism after my time in Iraq was to try to ignore the Middle East as much as possible.
You and the rest of the
research.
foreign policy establishment.
Sorry?
Said you and the rest of the
Yep,
foreign policy.
yep, I'm guilty. But to me, I'm in agreement. And I would add these asymmetric engagements in cost, where somebody lobs up a couple of $1,000 missile and we have to shoot it down with a Block 2 whatever from an Aegis destroyer. That can't go on. And you mentioned something, and this is probably just me agreeing, but what we can learn from the Israelis and from the Ukrainians, I would add, is how to conduct these operations on the cheap again. You know, in the Second World War, and even before that, the hallmark of American was reliable and cheap. You know, Sherman tanks, not the best tank, but it was good enough, and we made 30,000 of them or whatever. We need to learn how to be making the $1,000 solution for these $1,000 problems. And that, to me, then that goes back to acquisition and our whole broken defense production industry and all. But to me, that's a huge problem. But that's my cop out. Otherwise, I generally agree with the crew on what we should be doing regarding Israel.
I would also say there was actually a split within kind of restraint about the Abraham Accords. I kind of followed in the camp that they were actually good because it did create a pathway that you had states of aligned interests to come together to deter a common adversary. My one concern, and again, I broadly think it was a good thing, is that the Abraham Accords turn into an Arab NATO, and that we do something like give a security guarantee to Saudi Arabia. That creates the wrong incentives, and instead of us having a pathway to do less in the region, we ultimately get pulled more into. Now, so that's my big concern with any type of security architecture. I'm not reflexively opposed to it, but I do have that one concern. I just have kind of an observation, and it's more kind of from a tactical sense about the path forward for Israel. And it kind of actually is related to my remarks about Ukraine. I don't know, even if you were, I don't know how many restraints they have or haven't put on themselves. But even if they were to go more full bore, I don't know how they're going to be able, as a society and economically and militarily, because of their structure of the military, are going to sustain a a military operation against Hamas and then Palestinian militants in the West Bank, and then run a longer-term counterinsurgency and reconstruction effort. Incredibly costly and drain the Israeli economy of a workforce and whatnot. So I kind of worry, and I think this has been brought up, is that Israel, you can't blame them. You can't blame them. The horrors of October 7th, their reaction, you can't just brush that away. That they may be making some of the same mistakes we made in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's not to undermine or dispute the need for them to do what they're doing, or even really to quibble with the policy itself. Is just my big question is around the issue of sustainability.
Any more comments? Well, I'll just say one thing. What I heard on the debate the other night was that the easy solution to all of this, just a very simple solution to this, is just have a ceasefire and then a two-state solution. And we do those two very simple things, right? The two things that no one can get done, that have been tried for decades. Just do it, magic wand, right? Oh, ceasefire, Hamas will agree to that.
The question,
Two-state solution, no problem.
The question was, what if there's no deal to be had?
Yeah.
Which you say, well, we need a deal.
Yeah.
Gotta have a deal.
I mean, just, like that's a plan. Oh, ceasefire and two-state solution. Okay, go for it.
And
No one's gotten it done yet.
I mean, just to add to tag something that Dan said, and it's not just the perennial problem of Gaza and the West Bank, but it's the North. There are tens of thousands of Israelis who left their homes on 10/7 and have not yet returned, and they will have to go back someday. And if you ask an Israeli, do you want us to fight so you can go back home? The answer is yes.
Yeah. Well, and another thing that just hasn't been brought up, but I don't understand how you could even talk of a ceasefire and like just signing your name on the dotted line without actually getting transparency on what's happening on the Egyptian side, and getting control of that, because that's been a major factor in Hamas's build-up, is what it's been able to bring in on the other side of Gaza.
That's a thorny diplomatic question.
No, exactly. But I mean, this is the thing that dogged us in Afghanistan with the way Pakistan had its enduring interest of supporting the Taliban. Egypt and its army seems to have this enduring interest in allowing Hamas to fester. So it is a very difficult one.
If I had a thought on that or an answer to that, it would be to allow Israel to retain custody of the Philadelphia corridor for the indefinite future and create conditions on the ground that allow you to actually address this diplomatically rather than being really, really afraid of annoying Cairo.
Yeah. Sorry. Sudan.
Okay, moving to our next issue, China. Another easy one. The failure of the engagement strategy is now so evident that few cling to the idea that Red China is our friend. Through engagement, we have created a monster. China is engaged in a naval and nuclear buildup. They are taking a leading role in the BRICS bloc to replace the dollar as a global currency, seeking a central role in global diplomacy that has traditionally been occupied by the United States, stealing our technology, threatening Taiwan, and more oppressing their people. Are we in the midst of a new Cold War with China, and what can we do about it? Let's start with T-Mac. You want me to begin?
Yeah, absolutely.
Insofar as the term Cold War conjures up images of 1945 to 1991, I don't think that is a very fair comparison. I do think it is an adversarial relationship. It is certainly a contested and competitive relationship. I do not want to see it become an outright hostile relationship. Again, the enemy gets a vote. We may not have a say in the matter. Taiwan is obviously the biggest looming threat, but right now what we're seeing from the Chinese Navy is very provocative efforts to ram Filipino merchant vessels, and cut off certain areas, certain islands, from access from the sea, which forces them to literally airdrop supplies on these islands from Manila. And sometimes those are intercepted. This is all a very dangerous situation. China is being provocative right now. China is being aggressive. China is testing our perimeters and our boundaries and seeing how we'll react. And right now, we're not reacting, which is the worst possible thing you could do. That's how you test parameters more. That's how they test boundaries more. And until they encounter something where they get a significant response, they won't back off. This is also something that Iran does. Iran, just briefly, the Iranian regime is very afraid of a direct confrontation with the United States. It doesn't believe it will survive it. So when you hit them on the nose, as we did in the 80s with Operation Praying Mantis, or we did with the Soleimani strike, they back off. The Chinese regime is similarly insecure, and for good reason. But a direct conflict between the two of us would be a catastrophic conflict. I want to avoid it. The way to avoid it is to put forward position naval assets to build a blue water navy sufficient to meet the threat, and to do so on a timeline that is commensurate with what we understand to be China's adventurist objectives. In the absence of that, China will keep pushing until it encounters something where it finds out we don't like that, and then perhaps you get an escalation spiral, which is the last thing we want.
So I agree, and I'd follow on that. Prudent things that we should be doing, and the Biden administration has said we're doing it. I don't know if I buy it, but letting chips go away was bad, and we need to make those ourselves. Strategic items shouldn't be farmed out, and that's not a hit on Taiwan. I'm very pro Taiwan. It's a little scary that Nancy Pelosi did a great thing for Taiwan. She's the one who did it by going, and sort of trying to force the Biden administration into a stronger position to support Taiwan. But the U.S. has a lot of forms of leadership, right? Obviously, the military side is absolutely crucial, but helping the Asians and Pacific allies overcome their World War II rightful loathing of Japan is an incredibly important piece of the puzzle. The fact that there are multilats, in the making that don't just rely on us. People ask, well, why can't you have NATO in Asia? Well, because NATO relied on a subservient Germany, and that couldn't happen in Asia because they hated the Japanese, and the threat. But I think also some U.S. diplomacy, I hope, is helping to overcome that. So the U.S. needs to exert its leadership, both in the straight up military aspect, but in continuing strong diplomatic efforts, as we are doing with the Philippines post Duterte, to get the Philippines back in our orbit. Those type of things. Yeah.
Just to put a period on this, I think we're all dancing around the big factor here, which is the need to rebuild the American defense industrial base.
Yeah. Yep.
And the need to export weapons to meet the supply and to meet the law of supply and demand out there. Because if we do not, there are other weapons suppliers out there, and a lot of them aren't our friends, and they will meet those needs whether we like it or not. And those are a lot of hard choices. It involves spending cuts. It may involve new taxes. It involves entitlement reform. It's a sort of thing that is very politically unpopular. And people who say, well, it's so politically unpopular that it just cannot be done. But I have yet to hear a politician use their pulpit to make the case for it. The assumption is, well, our hands are tied just because the American public won't accept it. That's a dodge. It's a dodge to get you out of the job of leadership, to make a compelling case for the existential crisis abroad and how we address it. First step is the defense industry.
And there's a benefit, because right now that other major supplier is proven that their stuff is junk and sell American, buy American. It's proven how it operates. We've got to make it. So, okay. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more on the defense industrial component. And one thing we could do, next administration should look into doing, is look into just borrowing the ship plans from our allies that we know work, rather than always putting like an American spin on it, where it's like literally like we juice it up with some extra weaponry. It's almost like a kind of Iron Man like joke, but it makes actually building the vessel more difficult and more likely to get delays, like we've seen. I began my remarks tonight kind of with a dire warning about the limits we're facing. I didn't even really talk about the fiscal limits, but the manpower limits, the limits of our people's willingness to bear costs for causes around the world. I want to emphasize that I don't want that to be a dire message, though. Our opponents have limits as well, and they're running into them. I mean, we've seen that Russia, despite making incredible investments in first strike capability and all sorts of new technology, and finally putting socks on their soldiers, like actually cannot just sweep over Ukraine as many thought they could in the first days of the war. They face serious manpower shortages too. And China faces serious limits on its ability. It is going to be losing the equivalent of a German-sized workforce every decade from now until the foreseeable future. It is economically entangled with us in a way that forbids it from antagonizing us too much. And one thing I think the next administration should do, since that's a nominal topic of this debate, is we should revisit the CHIPS Act, not just in two ways. We need to make better and more intelligent and more bankable investments in U.S. Technology dominance. We can't burden it with like daycare centers and all these other things that forbid people from actually putting the shovel into the ground. On the other side, I actually think we should get rid of those elements of the CHIPS Act which tend to foreclose China's technological future. I think that's a mistake along the lines of cutting off Japan from oil ahead of World War II. Allow them, I have faith in the mathematics, and Chinese mathematics say, basically, if you allow them a peaceful rise, you're very likely to get a peaceful fall. And in the medium term, their economy will shrink. Already, global capital is looking more towards Vietnam, towards the Philippines, towards Turkey, back towards Mexico, and looking to get out of China because it fears the erratic nature of Xi's rule and the unpredictability of what he could do in the economy. Allow those things to work for us, and I think they will work for us in the future.
There's been a lot of great remarks on the panel already. There's just two things I would add is that, I've spent most of the panel arguing that we have actually more limited interests into the region of the world. This is an area where we have real interests and that China is truly a real competitor and a real challenge. And I do agree that that we do need to repair our defense industrial base, and there's some longer term things that we need to do. But to Noah's point about we have this window here, and I've talked to smart people on both sides of the debate about how real that 2027 or 2028 window is. But if we're assuming that means that there are things that we have to do now to get ready. And considering how long it's going to take to repair our defense industrial base, and this isn't an argument not to do some of that, it means we're really going to have to make some hard trade-offs elsewhere. And this gets into tying back to my earlier remarks. It means we're going to have to do less in other parts of the world. And when we're talking about force structure, it means we're going to have to do, in a lot of ways, what the United States Marine Corps did with its Force 2030, is we're going to have to divest and shrink parts of our force, mainly the Army, so that we can invest in other parts of the force. And again, this isn't just a monetary thing. Michael got at this point really well, is that every recruit you have go in the Army is a recruit that the Navy could have to staff up those ships that Michael was talking about at the beginning. So there's really going to have to be some aggressive trade-offs made over the next few years to get ready for that. However, the good news is, and again, Michael was getting at this, is that, and John, you were actually alluding to this well earlier, is the good news is defense is dominant, and that in an area where most of the military conflict would be amphibious or airborne, those are incredibly difficult operations. And in an era where you have cheaper and cheaper defensive technologies as drones and things like that, the good news is if we can get out of our own way, we can scale a lot of those technologies, the Taiwanese in particular, who do have a robust technological industry. They just are not investing enough in their own defense. And that's a whole conversation around incentives and us sending them the wrong signals. But they are a lot of things that they can start doing that would significantly raise the cost of Chinese aggression. And, one thing I would say is that in Ukraine, when I visited, is that was actually the most interesting thing I saw, is that Ukraine effectively doesn't have a Navy. And yet they've been able to push back the Russian Black Sea Fleet not far enough where they still can't launch cruise missiles, but where they no longer are under threat from amphibious invasion. And it's with really incredibly cheap drones and missiles that they've built themselves without a lot of American support. So there's a lot of lessons you can apply from the Ukrainians of Black Sea over to Taiwan that they can do to deter China more effectively and for not as much cost as I think people believe.
Also, we should place some hope in amphibious invasion is so difficult. I mean, we have successful ones, Incheon, D-Day. That was done with the great military tradition we inherited from the British Empire that allows trust between NCOs and grunts, that orders can be adapted to the spirit in which they are given. This is something that I don't think the PLA has ever come close to replicating, and their very political military culture may forbid them from ever launching a successful amphibious assault on Taiwan. In fact, I would bet on it. Now, I'm not saying that we need to because of that we shouldn't invest in deterrence, but I think we should have a lot of hope that even though we are operating under serious constraints, our aging population, our fiscal commitments being out of control, we still have a lot of resources that our enemies don't have. And our culture is able to rebuild its military trust. We did it after Vietnam, and I think we can do it again.
Sorry, technical difficulties. All right, thank you. I'd like to move to the Q&A. So if you have cards, I just have a bunch, but send them this way and maybe we can fit them in. First question, and this is a topic, and there are a lot of different topics I'm getting from the audience, so I'm trying to go to topics we haven't really discussed. What do you think the future of the American nuclear umbrella is? If we are facing limits, should we accept the rise of some allies, for example, Japan, as nuclear powers? And, I would expand on that and say, should we allow, a whole lot of countries to just go nuclear in the hopes that it would create some kind of balance of terror?
I'm a little uncomfortable with a multiplicity of nuclear states when you have the dynamics of a multipolar dynamic versus a bipolar dynamic is a little bit more unpredictable. The future of the United States nuclear arsenal better be to update them because they're all reaching the end of their life expectancy programs, their life extension programs rather, and certainly to modernize the triad. And I think that we could probably be a little bit more comfortable with some of our allies as nuclear threshold states, undeclared breakout capability with Japan and South Korea and perhaps some others. But no, I would be discomfited by the proliferation of nuclear weapons as a response to the conditions in their neighborhood, because what does that say about us? It says the United States nuclear umbrella ain't worth it anymore.
And I'd take it in a little bit different direction. I don't think that we can live in a world where states that don't like the way the world works hide behind their nuclear umbrella to change the world order. And so that's a reason why Russia needs to be defeated. We have to modernize. I think I'm thinking back to undergrad IR articles from the early 90s about this. So it was Mearsheimer and Walt, where somebody wrote the stability of a multipolar nuclear world and then the instability of the same world. And I don't think anything has changed. I think that only one country has used nuclear weapons. We've bloody well never used them again, and I don't think that we would, unless frankly has a revenge strike. And I think that the world is better off with the fewer people have the most awesome weapon that we have. So,
I mean, I'm as a fiscal conservative, I don't think we should build any more until we use all the ones we have. That's it's all Joe Sobran joke. I'm not an expert on nuclear proliferation. I think it's in the interest of some of our allies to become threshold powers. Just and I think it's rational. I think it'll be hard to prevent. We also don't have like a kind of preventative remedy. If what would you do to Poland tomorrow if they announced that they had nuclear capability? Would you do what you do to North Korea and try that for a few decades? I wouldn't. So I think states are going to make their own decisions on this, and the balance probably is towards proliferation in the long run.
I think that, speaking about the United States, is that we do want to maintain a nuclear arsenal. I am somebody who believes that actually nuclear arsenal is important guarantor of our security and actually helps deter existential threats, and therefore enables us in many ways to pursue a more restrained foreign policy. And we can be more confident in the fact that some of our homeland, our conditions, our economic prosperity, it is harder to threaten those core things when you do have nuclear weapons. I am concerned about the scale and cost of nuclear modernization. It is spiraling out of control. I am very concerned. This is somewhat adjacent to the question, and I apologize. It seems like I'm dodging it. I am concerned about the complete breakdown in any type of ability for the United States to engage in arms control diplomacy with China, with Russia, even with North Korea and Iran and other countries that are moving or have these weapons or are moving towards them. And, I think that's actually a great conservative tradition and something conservative movement should be proud of. Those were two of the greatest accomplishments, I think, of the Reagan administration and of the Bush administration, was getting those arms agreements as the Soviet Union was collapsing, because it helped make the collapse of the Soviet Union less chaotic. And unfortunately, since I believe the mid-90s, I could be off there, we haven't had significant arms control agreement. So I think that's kind of the balancing act there, is that you need to have a strong, robust nuclear deterrent by the United States, but you also need to have a world where there is some type of framework where you can negotiate with countries and put some types of limits on these things. But because of our actions, particularly over the last 20 years, that's harder to do. And to be a little more specific about that, particularly what happened with Libya, where we had a diplomatic breakthrough of Gaddafi. It started in the late 90s. This is one of the few positive things that came out of the Iraq War, is he was concerned about an overthrow, so he did cave and open up the books on his weapons mass destruction program. He actually started cooperating with us on terrorist issues. But then we overthrew him, and then the message to a lot of states, whether it's Iran or North Korea, is that do not give up your programs or your nuclear weapons altogether. And it made the Iran deal that we eventually got much worse because of one, how it was negotiated, but the fact that it followed the Libyan intervention because of the messages sent to other nations around the need to acquire weapons of mass destruction. So I think that is a real travesty, or one of the under-discussed tragedies the last 20 years around American foreign policy, is the complete inability to do that.
I just want to say this question is great because we've been nodding along with our colleagues over here way too much. Nuclear non-proliferation agreements are great. Arms control agreements are great, as long as both parties are observing them. Mm-hmm. Very often, it's just us. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was just us until we got out, because we were the only party responsive to it. You can talk about all these agreements as though they're happy window dressing. They make you feel good. But if you're constraining yourself and liberating your adversaries by giving them the cover of diplomatic legitimacy, you're doing harm to your position, not advancing it.
And similar, but on the sideline of this, I think investment in nuclear command and control is always something that needs to be a high level of focus, like how the triad actually works. The deterrence is only deterring if people think it's going to deter, if it's going to actually function. And in a world of AI and deep fakes, to everything down to voices, the Cold War, a couple of Cold War scares were because of glitches in defense systems, and then some that made it look like massive strikes were coming. It happened to us, it happened to the Soviets, and smart people said, oh, wait, no, that's a test, but those same smart people might be fooled now by the same failure because it looks so damn real. And so securing our nuclear command and control systems, I think, is just as important as a talk about modernization and the actual weapons.
Yeah, nuclear's coming back. Just for everyone's information, you're gonna be talking a lot more about it. So, next question. And this is a topic that we've discussed, but I just like this question because it's something I think about a lot. And just get a brief answer from everybody on this because we've already discussed it. For both sides, what is an acceptable peace in Ukraine?
From whose perspective?
That's
Okay.
yeah. That's,
Well, how about from a U.S. because we're talking about the United States, just so from a U.S. perspective, because I think it's a lot tougher.
Well, the rhetorical answer is whole and at peace. That's what the U.S. position is, and that's not going to change. The achievable answer is probably something a lot less than that. But we don't know what peace looks like now because peace is determined by the conditions on the battlefield. The conditions on the battlefield determine who has leverage in the negotiating table, and the negotiating table determines what the peace is. The battlefield conditions are far from too fluid right now and probably for the foreseeable future for us to say with any assurance what a peace deal looks like. Those who are saying it are telling you their own priors, their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations, but they're not basing it on anything concrete. You need to see what the battlefield situation looks like to the point at which one party or the other believes they can no longer achieve their strategic or tactical objectives on the battlefield and say, okay, well, then we're going to head to the negotiating table and use whatever leverage we have there, whatever we have there. You can't foresee that. We certainly can't wish it into existence.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you see the Ukrainians planning for what could happen in the case of a Trump victory, for example. I think that's the Kursk offensive. At the moment, they're doing better than the Germans did, which is kind of cool. But okay, World War II humor. But you know, it's clearly we have to grab something so that if we're forced to do some card trading, we have something to trade to get something that we want back. And then, you know, there could be a time when Kyiv has to make some hard choices about, you know, if it's not whole, what is the vital that we're willing to keep fighting for? I don't think we're there yet. I don't think the war situation has led there. And the U.S. promises and the Western promises mean that they don't necessarily have to make that choice yet. But yeah, I agree. I mean, we just don't know. Even in the next, well, it's not 2 months because no new president comes until January, but in the next 6 months, it could flip completely one way or the other. And we don't know. But we can guarantee it will be a foreign policy priority for the next administration. Yeah.
It's very hard to say. Stability is not just the battlefield conditions, but also the political viability of the next Ukrainian government whenever there are elections. You know, we don't know kind of where things stand politically in Ukraine. Usually after a trauma like this, the ultra-nationalist side will tend to prevail politically in the survivor state, and will tend to control the narrative unless it's discredited by something. But it could be, you know, in the history of these things, it could be the peace deal itself discredits a government in the eyes of its people. So it's very hard to predict what will happen when the strains are so high. It also depends on what kind of, you know, Zelensky has talked about a non-NATO but filled with NATO countries security guarantee. I don't know if there's an appetite for Germany or France to sign on to anything like that after they tried to sign Minsk and it fell apart. So no, I see an open wound on the continent for a while, and the possibility of a frozen conflict, the one that hasn't ended in the next administration.
I think that for the United States, we have really two key interests around the war going forward and a potential negotiated settlement. The first is more related to the war, how the war progresses, and that is avoiding getting sucked into the war. That, in my view, is still a real risk. We have a lot of forces on the periphery of Ukraine. This was something the Biden administration did. They pushed forward about 20,000 more troops. We're actively aiding Ukrainian operations through intelligence support missions, mainly airborne ones in the Black Sea. There is a huge risk as the war goes on is that there could be an unintentional confrontation between U.S. or NATO aircraft or troops on the Romanian and Polish border in particular, and that has almost happened a couple times. We could also see, as Ukrainian positions worsen, another demand for either doing something like pushing contractors forward or implementing a no-fly zone again. I do worry about the United States sleepwalking into something like that, particularly the Biden administration, which is incredibly concerned about its legacy, and they clearly view Ukraine, despite how bad their policies have been, as part of its legacy. So that's a concern I have in the closing months of the Biden administration. More towards the negotiated settlement, I think the United States' interest, again, is that we don't take on another security burden, is that we ultimately do not have another a country that we are responsible for defending. I've been very critical, I will say, of arming and supplying Ukraine, but I would actually be more comfortable arming Ukraine as part of negotiated settlement as long as it doesn't involve a security commitment. So some people have called that the Israel model. Of course, we've talked a lot about capacity constraints. It would cost a lot of money, and our capacity to completely rebuild their military or properly arm them for defensive operations would be constrained. But for me, those, I think, for the United States are the two key interests that we need to think about going forward. And that's without getting into what a peace could look like, because I think it's right. It's ultimately the United States needs to create the conditions for it to happen, as opposed to dictating where every line ultimately ends up.
Very good. Okay, I'm going to sort of paraphrase this one. There's a real think piece for you. If you look at the precursor violence to World War II, Japan's invasion of Manchuria, for example, or other actions in China, what Libya was doing in Africa, the Spanish Civil War, disruptions between Russia and Poland, all those kind of things, all the things that were going on before World War II was really started. Using that as an analogy, when you look at Ukraine, when you look at the Middle East, when you look at what's happening in the South China Sea, when you look at global terrorism and migration, all these other disruptions, are we walking into World War III right now?
No, thank God. While there's geopolitical disruption and uncertainty, and there's revanchism and wars and rumors of wars and every biblical allusion you can think of, all the major military powers are older and much, much older. We do not have young men to just throw around and waste. And what we've seen in the Ukraine-Russian war is that if it's short of a nuclear war, it can still be a war that chews up manpower in the industrial capacities of the 20th century wars before it. I think there's going to be incredible hesitance for I mean, if you're a Social Security dependent relying on 3 workers now when you're relying on 37 in the World War II, are you willing to kill 2 of them, like in your last 20 years of life, for your political ideals to triumph 6,000 miles away from you? I highly doubt it.
I mean, the metaphor is imperfect, but depending on how you view the level of aggression from our adversaries in China and Moscow, maybe you prefer the Morocco crisis or the Balkan Wars in 1913. You can say that there are prospects on the horizon because these are great powers testing their parameters in their neighborhoods and trying to achieve advantage over their competitors. And you can miscalculate into a big war. You may not want a big war, but you stumble into one by triggering defense obligations. I don't think the prospect can be ruled out. I don't think the metaphor is perfect. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And I don't think you can rule it out.
And I think, and I started to think about this during the earlier part of the debate when we were talking about the nature of a new Cold War. I think that the 19 teens feel more accurate to me than the 1930s. And for example, right, like you said, U.S. and China, it's not a Cold War. It's something more like the British and the German naval arms race, and yet they were still cousins, and nobody believed a war would come, but at the same time, every military on earth was toasting every day for the war that would come, so they could finally get over their 100 years of peace, and then look what they got the trenches. But I think that time frame of just endless crisis everywhere, that feels more like what we're in. And so I wouldn't say walking toward a war. And I'm not going to say running toward it either. I do think there's the danger of the sleepwalking part that existed, from 1900 to 1914. And one of these wars blowing up in a way that becomes sort of global. I'm pretty pessimistic. I think it is going to happen. So that's just my opinion.
I'm not that pessimistic.
Well, so
I don't think anybody wants wars.
Right.
I don't think anybody benefits from a big conflagration. And so we can take some solace at least in this.
And I think most people, unlike in World War I, most people would understand a great power war now to be costly and dangerous, whereas before World War I, many people thought it'd be over in the summer. I'm worried about. I mean, my one thing that keeps me up at night that isn't World War III is major state collapse. I mean, if the North Korean state dissolved into its own incoherence tomorrow night, we would be faced with a humanitarian crisis and a political crisis on the Korean Peninsula, maybe the whole Pacific, that would be almost as frightening as open war, both in trying to secure the nuclear goods in Korea, prevent state collapse of South Korea as millions of people rush over the border, or trying to predict what China would do as millions of people rush over its border.
Yeah.
Or more frightening, state collapse of China itself too, which would have unbelievably dire economic consequences for us.
every continent has a couple of those, even ours. So I agree with you.
I mean, because we saw the COVID stress test of all nations. We saw what it did to the Northern Triangle and other nations in the Western Hemisphere that actually seemed to be, at least somewhat functional, turned out to not be. And so that's what keeps me up at night more than World War III.
Look, Dan, you want one more final word?
I don't know how to top that.
I think I actually addressed this a little bit in my last answer, is I am particularly concerned about sleepwalking into a war over Ukraine. I have similar concerns around China and Taiwan, but not as intense. I am very, very concerned, though, about us unintentionally starting a major, or not starting, but getting sucked into a major conflict in the Middle East, particularly with Iran. Noah mentioned the Soleimani strike earlier. I think actually what caused the Iranians to back off was more COVID. I think people forget is that for 2 months after that strike is that there were very aggressive attacks on American facilities. Even after the al-Assad attacks, there were U.S. airmen killed. And Trump had stepped off the escalation ladder, but they were still trying to inflict pain. And ultimately, COVID tamped that down. And so just like in June of 2019, we avoided that catastrophe. But that's the place I'm most concerned about, is us unintentionally getting pulled into a major war in the Middle East yet again. That is absolutely not in our interest and could be extremely bloody and dangerous.
Thank you. Okay, well, we're out of time. I don't know if we've solved anything, but it was certainly a lively exchange of views. So thank you to our panelists for your insightful remarks. Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks again to NRI, to Aaron Fox Schiff, and to Lafayette Company for putting on this event. One final announcement: the Institute of World Politics will have its fabulous and unforgettable annual gala on Wednesday, October 9th at the magnificent Jefferson Building in the Library of Congress. And you can learn more about this exceptional event at our website, iwp.edu/gala. And we hope to see you all there. But thank you for coming, and have a great evening. Thanks so much.